Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our first of 3 workshops in the BMP Agricultural Stewardship series with a focus on soil health and erosion. My name is Brendan Jacobs, and I am the Stewardship Specialist with the Raisin Region Conservation Authority, as well as the coordinator for the Alice Ontario East program. And I will be your host for today's workshop. Before we get going, I'd like to thank everyone for filling out the pre-workshop survey. If you don't have a chance to complete the survey, we will share the link with you in the chat below. The workshop today will be recorded, as we hope to be able to make the recording available to folks who are not able to be with us today. As such, we ask that your camera and microphone remain off throughout the duration of the presentations. We have 4 presentations for you today that will cover topics surrounding soil health, nutrient management, soil erosion, and cover crops. Today's presentations are pre-recorded to avoid some of the glitches that can happen over the course of a virtual workshop. We will begin the workshop by rolling through all of the presentations, after which there will be a question and answer or discussion period. If at any point during the presentation you have any questions regarding one of the topics, please type it into the chat box. We will compile the questions and endeavor to answer as many as we can live prior to the end of the workshop. If we run out of time, we will be happy to provide answers to you afterwards via email. The same goes that at any point during the workshop, if you happen to have any technical glitches, we do have somebody standing by who may be able to help. So we would ask that you type in the issue you're having into the chat box as well, and we will try to help you remedy that as quickly as possible. Now let's get started with our first presentation. Our first presenter is Sebastian Belliard on the topic of soil health and soil BMPs. This is a very dense topic, and Sebastian has tried to fit as much information as possible into his presentation, which is in 2 parts. Soil health theory being the first part, and how to improve your soil health is the second. Due to time constraints, we will be running through part 1 of the presentation today so that we have time to fit in our other presenters as well as answer your questions. A link to the complete 2-part presentation will be sent to all those who register so that you can view the second part of the presentation at your leisure. Sebastian is a soil management specialist with the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs for Eastern Ontario. His focus is on soil health assessments.
Hello, Raisin River. My name is Sebastian Belliard. I'm a soil management specialist with OMAFRA based in Kentville. It's a little awkward for me because I'm not actually around. This is a recorded presentation, but I'm happy to contribute regardless with a presentation on understanding and assessing soil health. 3 general things I want to cover today. What is soil health and why should you care? How can you tell if your soil is actually healthy or not? And what can you do to make those soils healthier? What is soil health? There's lots of definitions out there. In some ways, I don't really care which one you use, but I like these 2 from Ag Canada and from the USDA NRCS for a couple of reasons. I like the fact that Ag Canada focuses us on crop growth, which I think is important because usually when we're looking at soil health and we're talking about it, trying to understand it, it's from an agricultural perspective. And that's important for some reasons that we don't need to get into, but keep that in mind. The reason why I really like this USDA definition, defining it as the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans, is for that focus on function. And I like that because it helps guide us a little bit in terms of what we need to be looking for, what we need to be trying to measure or understand to know whether our soils are healthy, and that's that function, those soil functions. So what are those soil functions? Well, there are some slightly different lists, but all the important ones are here. Things like plant production, crop growth, essentially in this context, matter cycling, things like breaking down crop residues and organic amendments and releasing those nutrients back into the system, creating a habitat for biological activity, things like worms, springtails, and fungi and bacteria, all those organisms that contribute to making the soil a functioning living system. There's the filtering and buffering of water. We know that the soil accepts water from the atmosphere and then filters it through, recharges groundwater, but also stores water and releases it for plants. And then there's carbon sequestration. We know that soil has a very big role to play in the carbon cycle and hopefully in carbon sequestration. So here's a slightly different list, but I do like this one. I bring it up because I like how it ties those functions back to our goals when it comes to farming, right? There's plant productivity, getting that yield, but also waste recycling, making sure that the system continues, and environmental protection, you know, making sure that the water and the soil and the air that we actually depend on for our farming systems aren't becoming degraded. So how can you know if your soil is healthy? Well, like a lot of things, there are different ways of knowing. And I'll try to go through some of each of these categories, but I think it's important to note that you don't have to necessarily rely on lab tests or microbiologists or even soil specialists to get a sense of how healthy the soil is, to be able to tell, at least in some ways, whether your soil is functioning properly, if your soil is healthy, and what might be some of its limitations. So I'll try to go through some ways of knowing in each of these categories. I think the first one is the easiest. It's just experiential. Your experience as a grower, working that soil year in and year out. There are things that you notice, things that in your experience of working that land that can tell you something about soil health. And so I've got here, a list of some answers from a SARE survey in the US a few years ago about, basically asking growers how do they describe their soils and how do they know if their soils are healthy. And so I've highlighted a few here that might be interesting. They said that their healthier soils sponged up and held more water, but they also dried out sooner in the spring. Their crop residues broke down more rapidly in the non-growing season. But also, kind of more indirectly, their fuel costs are way down. Their tractor pulls more easily as they go through the field. Maybe if you're lucky, your crop yields are higher as well. All these things that sort of fit in and come out of the soil system that you can use also to get a sense, kind of visceral sense of whether that field is performing well, whether that soil is healthy from an agricultural standpoint. Now, getting into maybe more robust assessment methods than, this field feels nice while I'm driving over it. This is kind of what I call observational assessments. And I really think this is, in a lot of ways, this is the sweet spot, because you don't necessarily need to be a scientist or an expert to do these. Some of these might need a bit of training to sort of really get good and confident in them. But in the end, anybody here could do these soil health assessments and get good knowledge out of them. So I've got a list here of some that I've thought of. I'll go through some of these in a bit more detail, but things like crop performance, right? Like if the soil's healthy, well, it should grow a good crop. And soil structure is really an important one. Surface quality, percent residue cover, earthworm or earthworm midden counts, infiltration rate, how fast the water soaks into the soil, penetration resistance, how hard it is, is the topsoil nice and deep, and does it have a nice dark color? Are those roots growing the way they should to be able to get everything that they need? Are there symptoms of erosion that Kevin might have mentioned earlier? And yes, the underwear test. But I'd like to sit for a little bit with this picture here on the right, because I think it really illustrates the fact that, we can tell a healthy soil from an unhealthy soil, at least at the kind of extremes. We can all see from these two spadefuls which one of these is the healthier soil, right? Like which one would you rather grow a crop out of? And that's pretty obvious. So let's get a little bit into the details. So one of my favorite evaluation methods is visual soil structure assessments. It's essentially what we saw in the previous slide, but with a little bit more rigor, and gives you a bit more confidence in actually being able to assess a spade full of soil, to say, yes, this is a good structure, or like, no, this isn't as good as it could be. And really, to do that, you need a system. In this case, we're using the Visual Evaluation of Soil Structure, or VES, which is a system developed by some soil scientists out of Scotland, among other places, that we've adopted here. And I really like that it allows for that observation to be a bit more quantitative, a scale of 1 to 5, with a bit of interpretation in there as well. I think it's a really valuable tool to take into the field. If you want a bit more detail, there's a YouTube link on the left here, where I can take you through in video form how to use this, how in scoring a soil in Ontario. If you wanted to actually print out the PDF and take it to the field yourself, that second link should take you to a file that you can download and print for yourself. And on top of the fact that with just a little bit of training, everyone should be able to do this assessment, I really like soil structure as a soil health indicator, because it integrates all the chemical, physical, and biological things that make a soil healthy into one sort of key indicator, so that you know that if your soil looks like it does here on the left, with roots growing all through it, nice, very well defined, small, crumbly aggregates, then things are going well. Whereas if you're seeing what we've got here on the right, or even worse, something like this, then something is wrong, and you need to have a look at what might be causing that. One of the reasons why that good soil structure is so important is because of water. Having a range of aggregate sizes means a range of soil pore sizes, which means that the soil is able to both drain water more effectively, but also to hold on to more water in a way that makes it more accessible to plants. So not too tightly that they can't get at it, but also tightly enough that it doesn't just drain away. And you can see that here in this image of the optimum water range, which in a well-structured soil is much wider from being too poorly drained, too saturated to have enough oxygen for roots to grow, but also having enough water that we don't get to that permanent wilting point. Whereas in a compacted soil, that range is much narrower, because there aren't as many pores or gaps in the soil. Anytime that soil is saturated, there's no air left there for those roots to get oxygen from. And once it starts drying out, it very quickly gets just too hard for the roots to grow through. And this is a really good visual representation of that with a non-compacted soil in the left, where you can see nice big pores that are connected and continuous, that go through the sample here. And once that's compacted, you see that really the first thing that disappears is those big pores, the ones that would channel water through, the ones that roots would grow through, and the ones that let those roots grow and breathe. And speaking of breathing, the surface of the soil has to be open enough for gas exchange to happen, so that those roots can get oxygen to breathe, and then also release the CO2 that they basically respire out. And it's the same thing for water also. If we're talking about infiltration, that soil surface needs to have open pores at the surface for the water to even be able to enter the soil profile at all, to be able to percolate through. And here's another kind of 5-point scale for assessing soil surface quality. Is it open? Is it protected by residue or living plant cover, or is it sealed and crusted and not allowing anything through? So what's happening when you see a soil that's crusted like this is that any rain that does fall isn't able to infiltrate, and so instead runs off, which means wasted precipitation and risk for erosion. Next, we'll move to counting worms, and I really like worms. I'm a big worm nerd, There's two different ways you can do this. One is just to actually count worms in a spade full of soil, so about 8 by 8 by 8 inches of soil, and actually sifting through it and counting the worms that you find. It doesn't work so well in the heat of summer when worms are hiding from that heat and the dryness. They might burrow deeper, they might be harder to find, but otherwise you should be able to find at least 10 to 15 earthworms in a good sample. The other thing we can do for earthworms is to count middens, and so middens are these clumps of residue that you're seeing on the right picture here. That's all earthworm action. It's a specific kind of earthworm that we're counting there, those deep burrowing dew worms or night crawlers, whatever you call them. They have a really important role because of their deep burrowing action in maintaining soil functions. And I think after soybeans is a really good time to be counting those, because there's usually not that much residue on the ground, and so it's a lot easier to see the pattern there. You can see it a couple weeks after soybean harvest, where that nice spread pattern that you got out of the combine has started to clump up, and all of that is deep burrowing earthworm action, sort of creating a nice roof over their burrow to keep that microclimate and give them something to feed on. And so you should be able to find a good number would be 5 or 6 earthworm middens in a square foot sample. Here you can see, this wasn't a great soil sample, but I found 4 just in this. So in case you're thinking 6 middens is a lot, I'll show you this video that comes from my front yard. And this is at night, because that's what you do when you're a soil nerd. You go and film worms at night. And then in the middle, you can see here what I mean by the really important role that they play in soil function. This is a poorly drained, very fine sandy loam. You can see that from the orange splotches there and the light gray colors, that this is a poorly drained soil. And so water doesn't really move easily through this soil profile. But if you look at this worm burrow that's exposed here, you can see that it is dark and enriched in organic matter, and it's just this big channel that's going deep down into that subsoil, that if you look at the picture on the furthest right here, you can see roots will follow those channels. Those are basically highways for roots to go down. They're enriched with that organic matter, they've got nutrients, and it's just the path of least resistance for those roots to be able to go down into a subsoil and capture the resources that are there, nutrients and especially water, that otherwise they wouldn't have access to. And worms work really hard for us in the soil. Sometimes, I think a lot of times, we don't give them enough credit. This is a picture that I'd just like to share because it just blew my mind. It was from a field that was recently leveled, and I think it had been filled in also. So there's no plant matter for those worms to work with, and so they were actually making middens out of small gravel-sized pieces of rock. This is some limestone, and you can see in the picture on the left here that it has that clumping pattern. I didn't believe it at first, but if you look at the close-up here, you can see that there's some worm poop, some worm casts between those rocks, and there is a burrow under there. So, those worms are working hard for you. There are some things that you can do to make their work easier, and we'll get into that in a bit. The last thing that I want to say about these worms is just that that function of or that role of creating those deep sort of larger channels, those big macropores, it's such an important role in the soil that it is in every kind of soil there is something that fulfills that role. In this case, in the case of sort of coarser sands that worms don't like to live in because it kind of scratches their soft skin, you'll see ants, ant hills doing essentially the same thing, creating that porosity, aerating the soil, and creating those nice, those large channels and macropores through. I've even seen little pink crabs doing exactly the same thing in swampy mangrove forests. So really, those deep burrowing worms, I cannot stress enough how important those are for proper soil function. Now, root growth, I think, is one that is maybe a little bit easier to translate directly into, crop growth and productivity and essentially yield in the end. But it's not one that I think we look at enough. But here are some pictures that to see what we don't want to see. The picture on the left here, you can see a root that's deformed and it's flattened because the layer that is growing in right here is just too compact. There's just not the space for that root to grow through. There's not the pores for it to grow into and still keep its shape. So it is suffering. That plant is expending more energy than it needs to, trying to force its roots through any crack it can find in the soil, and really not being able to explore and get resources from a larger soil volume. And then on the right here, you can see a soybean root growing into a compacted soil where you can actually see those layers, and you can see that those roots have gone horizontally, and when things dry out, that root will not be able to access the water resources that it needs to keep going. And really what we want to see, again, is that nice crumbly structure. This isn't a silty clay loam, but a piece that had been in perennial grasses for a long time. And you can see there's roots all throughout this. They are able to capture anything that the soil has to offer them. Now, penetration resistance, I think, is not one that a lot of people go for because they think, oh, well, I need a penetrometer, and what am I going to do with that? It's just going to lay around. But you don't need a penetrometer. You can really use anything to poke the ground. Here's a picture of my summer student, Anna, trying to get a soil probe into a soil that is obviously hard and has some compaction. So you can use a tile probe, you can use basically anything that's long and pointy. If you do get a penetrometer, what you're looking for is about 300 psi for the point where roots will really kind of give up the ghost and not really want to grow through that. They'll try to find a way around it. But it's important to look also for the depth of that maximum resistance, where that compacted layer starts. And if you can, also push through it and see if there's a point where that starts getting easier to push through to get a sense of how deep that compacted layer is if you don't feel like digging. But the important thing there is, well, my video is covering, but here we can see on the top an uncompacted soil where those roots are able to grow all the way down through. At the bottom, we've got a line here where we have a compacted layer, and really those roots kind of stop growing at about here, the depth of that compacted layer. So when things do start getting drier later on in the summer, they just don't have the roots where the water is to be able to grow through it. The underwear test is a fun one that a lot of people like. Basically, you dig in a pair of cotton underwear. It's important that they be cotton and not synthetic, and washed is preferable. Leave them in for 2 months, and what you want to see is something that you might imagine a younger version of yourself wearing. But really just having the elastics left. So all that cotton, all that organic material having been munched away by the microbes. And this is kind of a proxy for how well your soil should be able to work through crop residue. So in terms of analytical soil health tests, lab tests, there are some out there. I don't want to forget to mention soil fertility because, again, if we're talking about soil health in an agricultural context, it is crucial to have that soil fertility figured out first. And then organic matter is the traditional kind of best all-around indicator for whether things are going well in the soil. There are other indicators that we use, but I don't think I'll go into too much detail on these. They could take their own presentation. I'll just say that we are working this year on getting baseline values for a range of soils across Ontario for these different indicators to be able to use them and score them and interpret them a bit more usefully when you're doing soil health tests.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sebastian. As I mentioned in the introduction, if at any point you have any questions, please type them into the chat box and we'll endeavor to answer as many of them as we can prior to the end of the workshop. Also, as mentioned, this was a two-part presentation put together by Sebastian. So he went over some of the basics of soil health in the first part, and we'll be sending around the complete two-part presentation to you after the workshop is being completed. Apologize for this, but it's just a matter of being able to fit everybody in and still leave some time for questions. So you'll have a chance to view the rest of the presentation and his how to improve your soil health at your leisure after the workshop. Our second presentation is on the topic of nutrient management planning, and Hugh Metcalfe will be our presenter. Hugh resides in Winchester and is a graduate of the Fish and Wildlife Technician Program at Sir Sanford Fleming College. He has been a nutrient management consultant since 2016, having gained experience through his work with Eastern Crop Doctor Incorporated. Hugh is now self-employed with his business Nature Aid, which offers several agricultural and environmental services from nutrient management planning to design and planting bird and pollinator-friendly garden havens.
Hi, folks. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a talk on nutrient management and just some of the work that I do. So a bit of an introduction. Nutrient management involves using nutrients. So it could be commercial fertilizer, manure, organic material. So just using it in a way that benefits crop production, but also does so in a way that protects the environment. So under-applying nutrients can affect crop yields negatively, but over-applying nutrients can also lead to leaching and runoff into surface water or groundwater. So there's many variables that determine nutrient application rates, soil fertility and slope, proximity to surface and groundwater as well. So how does nutrient management come into play for my farm operation? So your farm could already be involved with the best management practice relating to nutrient management. So it could include maintaining good soil health, minimizing runoff, just determining proper application rates as well. Your farm could also currently be in or become phased into Nutrient Management Act regulations, and that's usually through a nutrient management strategy or plan. The main trigger for requiring a nutrient management strategy, at least, is either building or expanding a barn or manure storage. And basically, these plans and strategies ensure that all the material, the manure on the farm that's generated on the farm is utilized. So kind of outline the strategy and plan. The strategy deals with the actual structures and that house the animals, and then the storage is usually associated with those structures that hold solid or liquid manure. And then the plan deals with that land application of those nutrients, and then usually in the case of manure, but it also can be other nutrients. And both the strategy and the plan ensure that there's setbacks to sensitive features like surface water, wells, tile inlets. So the strategy applies to either existing or new or expanding barns and manure storages, also anaerobic digesters. It also applies to new or expanding earthen lagoons, liquid lagoons, which is important because they don't always need a building permit. It ensures that there's regulated distances to sensitive features like wells and surface water. And it enables or ensures that there's at least 240 days of manure storage on the farm, which is important for the restrictive period, getting through that time when from December to March, when there's a restricted period for applying manure. It allows enough storage on the farm to account for that. And it's reviewed annually. So kind of the steps I take preparing a nutrient management strategy, I'll do a site visit. I'll identify any kind of sensitive features, surface water, wells, stuff like that. It's good to know an MDS, so a minimum distance separation, FYI, it can be very important for siting new barns, new storages for an odor potential. So it's good to keep in mind your MDS calculations. That can be just as important as the strategy itself. So I'll do an overview of the operation, kind of describe it to OMAF, what's going on, farmstead sketch, and then I'll kind of plug all that into NMAN, which is through AgriSuite. It's an OMAFRA program for entering nutrient management strategies and plans. Usually the strategies will go in for approval by OMAFRA, and there may be conditions attached to those approvals. And there's also a contingency plan too for accounting for any kind of storage issues as far as knowing when to spread, how much storage. So if something happens, can that manure be transferred or spread kind of off site? So this is an example here, a map showing 2 OCAs, so outdoor confinement areas on a beef operation. Kind of an idea of a part of a farmstead sketch showing the flow paths in this case that kind of flowed over existing permanent pasture. There was a bit of surface water in this area to the east. So I basically had to do up a map showing the location of the flow paths and that they didn't interrupt or come in contact with any surface water. So a nutrient management plan is required for a farm that generates over 300 nutrient units. So usually the storage, manure volumes is greater. So it applies to all the land application of nutrients. Usually it's manure. Can be also account for commercial fertilizers and organic materials. So it accounts for all for the soil types, crops, slopes, source water protection, the rates, and then all your setbacks. So it's basically a 5-year outlook of the nutrient requirements needed for crop rotation. And it's renewed every 5 years to account for animal number changes, any manure management changes as well. So the steps I take in developing a nutrient management plan. So I'll identify any sensitive features on the maps, so wells, surface water usually, any source water protection issues that may come up. Also soil types, slopes, any with the tillage methods may be, the manure application rates and then setbacks. And also ensure that the phosphorus and nitrogen rates are adequate for the crop. So they're suitable for the crop, what it actually requires, and there's no excess nutrients that can possibly leach, especially when you're dealing with phosphorus and runoff and stuff like that. So AgriSuite is a great tool to use. Anyone can use this through the OMAFRA website as a best management practice. So here's an idea of a map that shows the tile drainage maps, municipal drain maps, and kind of gives you an idea of the fields and their proximity to some of these sensitive features. So I'll incorporate this on a nutrient management plan. This kind of gives you an idea of some of the field, kind of good to take pictures sometimes because in this case, you've got a long sloping field that it does have some residue, so the runoff is a little more controlled, although it's a long slope, higher phosphorus soils. So obviously manure application rates had to be a little lower on this field. But it gives you an idea of what some of the terrain you have to deal with is like. This is the NMAN AgriSuite program. So basically I can go field by field, input the, in this case, fertilizer applications, manure applications. So what the crop would actually need and what it's removing. And then you can kind of do a balance at the end of each year to know if you're exceeding or if you're not meeting the crop requirements. So some of the best management practice. So I'll give you the definition here from OMAFRA. So it's a practical, affordable approach to conserving a farm's soil and water resources without sacrificing productivity. So probably one of the most important BMPs is improving soil health and knowing where the nutrient levels are at, in knowing when to make nutrient applications on the farm at certain fields or not to. Sometimes there's adequate nutrients in the soil already. frequent soil testing is definitely key. It's at least every 3 years, sometimes even sooner. And then knowing when you test and how you test is a big part of that too. And then bulk zoning, grid sampling, some different ways to sample certain fields. Bulk is more of an average, the whole field, while zone and grid kind of narrow down on possible problem areas in the field that may have lower nutrients. And you can kind of tailor your recommendations to kind of those analysis that you get back from the labs. So source water protection. So you're wanting to identify any areas of the farm that can pose a threat to surface or groundwater contamination. And then the risk management officer from the conservation authorities, they are identifying through their source protection plan any possible risks according to their policies. And it's really important to know for both the nutrient management strategy and plan, there can be restrictions to approvals or restrictions within fields for applications because of proximity to certain drinking water protection zones or significant drinking water protection zones, stuff like that, that have to be taken into account. And this is all on ag maps, which is a really handy tool through OMAFRA to identify some of those areas. So this is an area that I've identified for a nutrient management plan. It's a significant groundwater recharge area. It's a fairly low risk here, but it's a good idea to go through on a field by field basis and identify if there's higher risk areas or any kind of the groundwater, the source water protection zones. So improving soil health. So higher yields can draw more nutrients from the soil. And definitely with the higher crop prices now, it's warranting at least yearly testing to identify problem areas. And also important to know that nitrogen, at least in the nitrate form, is mobile in the soil for plant availability, but it can also lead to leaching if it's not used by the crop. So that's where nutrient rates, application rates are important. It's important to know the soil test results. And application to do with the late fall, early spring runoff too. It's important, especially with phosphorus, if it's running off the surface, can be an issue in the surface and groundwater. So manure applications. Soil test is very important, and manure test is even more important because knowing both those values allows you to kind of tailor your application rates. And there can be a big difference in the nutrient application or nutrient analysis, between animal types. For example, broiler or layered chicken manure versus dairy manure, there can be a huge difference in some of the nutrient values. So it's good to know, get the manure tested so you know exactly what you're dealing with. And just applying manure in order to build organic matter levels in the soil, which is important for some of the lighter soils. And then using either injection or mulch tillage for manure incorporation. Manure incorporation is important in some higher risk areas where erosion is a bigger problem. And then minimizing runoff. So observing the restricted period that I talked about from December 1st to March 31st. So basically in a time when the ground will be frozen and there's a higher risk of runoff in the spring or even later in the winter. So that's where it's important to ensure there's enough manure storage on the farm in order to avoid spreading during the winter or during periods where there's frozen ground. So if there's transfers you can put in place with neighbors or move it through a broker, if you know you're not going to have enough storage to last you basically from fall through the spring. And also not applying nutrients on saturated ground or before a heavy forecasted rain. It's important for runoff. And then also with the incorporation, or if you're applying on a standing crop, like alfalfa, or in the case where there's ample residue and runoff potential is lower. And knowing your soil types is important and their limits for runoff potential. So we're talking about the different hydrological soil groups from A to D. So A being your lowest runoff potential is your sand or sand loam, all the way through D, which has a higher runoff potential, so your clays. And you've got stuff in between, Your B's and C's are usually silty or silty clay. Buffer strips and setbacks. So usually you need at least a 3 meter, 10-foot strip next to surface water implying nutrients. And it's going to be greater on 30 plus parts per million phosphorus soils. Depending on how much phosphorus in the soil, that buffer zone will widen next to wells and surface water. And consider converting erosion-prone areas into buffer zones. Areas that are consistent issues may be better just in buffer area. Maintaining well setbacks, especially when we're dealing with municipal wells, and there's more of a setback there. And dealing with certain manures, like broiler or layer manure, which is a little more potent, and also dealing with some NASEM products, non-ag source material products, like biosolids. Some also just considerations here. OMAFRA has several resources on nutrient management, best management practices. They've got either PDF or book format, and they've been around for several years, and they're very good. It's always good to keep updated on new technology and regulations, and also use the AgriSuite tools for your own farm. It's available on the OMAFRA website. So that's it now, and I'll take a few questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Hugh. And we will take questions pertaining to the presentations at the end. I'd like now to introduce, I'd like now to introduce Kevin McKague from the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, who will provide us an introductory look at the problem of soil erosion and some of the BMPs that can be used to prevent it. Kevin is an agricultural engineer with OMAFRA based out of Woodstock, Ontario. He has worked in both the public and private sectors planning and implementing erosion control practices on cropland. He is a member of the OMAFRA soil team and leads the delivery of the OMAFRA agriculture erosion control structures planning and design course.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this noon hour workshop. And the topic today is soil erosion. We know that if we're trying to build soil health, we definitely have to tackle any soil erosion issues that might be on our farm. And chances are, if you're seeing soil erosion, there are things that you can do to help bring that under control, and it's going to be necessary if we want to see a good progression towards improving our soil health. So let's take a look at some of the options that we have to do that. Today, I just want to go over a few things with you, just in terms of the types of erosion and how to identify what the cause might be, as well as the things like the practices or best practices that you have to address it. So here's my outline, just the types of erosion, what effects that might have on productivity, some of your erosion control bearing BMPs, and I've broken that into some of the agronomic solutions versus structural solutions. And then how do we take a systems approach to that? And then at the end, just a quick little view at what you might be able to do to just evaluate your own farm's erosion risk, given the types of practices that you're using currently, and maybe explore other options that might increase or reduce the amount of erosion occurring. So here's our start here, just what some of the types of erosion, and water erosion or soil erosion by water is probably the dominant type that happens in Ontario. It's broken down into 3 or 4 subtypes. We've got things like what we call inter-rill erosion, or more often termed sheet erosion. So that's just that thin layer of soil that gets thinly taken away. It's very subtle. You don't really see it that much, but then it starts to gather and the energy starts to increase. You start to see these small rivulets or rills start to form in the field. And so now you're starting to see some of that erosion occurring. When you get further down the slope, then we start to see these ephemeral gullies start to build. And before you know it, you get to the bottom of the slope where there's a low draw, you get a good sized little channel through there. And so they're still not so big that you couldn't cross them with farm equipment, but nevertheless, they are quite significant in terms of soil loss. There are times, though, when if we don't take it under control, we can end up with these huge cuts in the field like this. And so then we are in trouble, and we do have difficulty crossing it, and it basically separates our field and that type of thing. So that's more of the classic gully erosion that you might see in the field. And finally, we have ditch bank erosion, so sloughing of the ditch banks, and that soil then entering into that stream or municipal drain directly that adds to our soil loss. The other type of erosion you may have experienced is wind erosion. We don't see that as much in Ontario. There's certain pockets, for example, Bradford Marsh or Holland Marsh, just north of Toronto. That's an organic soil, and so when it's vulnerable and dry and doesn't have a lot of cover, you can see days like that driving through there, and that's when it's happening and a lot of soil is moving on those days. And we can also see that on sandier soils, or which when are dry and not covered again, or even in the early spring and when there's no snow cover and things are dry and flat and the wind's moving across there, we can experience it in other areas as well. So it's not unheard of by any means in Ontario. The other one, which we don't think of or don't address too often, is tillage erosion, but that occurs whenever we till. And so when we're passing that tillage equipment across the field, especially when we're going downhill, the momentum of that soil is down slope. And so as we go down, every time we pass, we're moving that soil gradually down the hill. So after many years, that soil eventually makes it to the bottom, because even if we did go up the hill once in a while, the distance the soil travels up the hill is not as far as the distance it travels down the hill when you go down slope. And so you end up often a sign of tillage erosion are these eroded knolls or light knolls where the subsoil is exposed, and you see the darker soil in the low areas. And so that would be a good indicator that tillage erosion is occurring. Now, I just wanted to mention that there is an interplay sometimes between these types of erosion. For example, tillage and water is a unique little interplay. You may have a ephemeral gully, something like this, in your field, and so what are you going to do with it? Well, most people are going to take the cultivator or the disc and they're going to fill it up, and so that nice topsoil, they fill in that gully, and yeah, when they're all done, it looks pretty good. But the next year, the water is moving down that hill again, and it probably looks like this again. And so that what do? We take that nice topsoil, take the cultivator, and we put it back in again. So eventually all that soil is moving out of that channel and downstream. And so we're gradually losing that topsoil through time by that combination of tillage and water erosion, just through that repetitive erode, till, repeat. The other one that I've seen is a wind and water interaction. So this is an example in southern Ontario where we had a field that we were actually monitoring in this watershed phosphorus loss, and it was sort of going along pretty much similar amount. But then by March of 2017, we saw this huge rise, and we wondered why that was occurring. Well, when we look back at some of the weather the previous couple of weeks of that event, we noticed that there was a high wind event and a wind erosion situation in that watershed a few weeks before. And so this is what it looked like on that day, March 8th. And by March 9th, that after the winds had died down, we had a good pile of sediment along the road ditches and in the scrape ditches in the fields. And that stuff really had a lot of organic matter in it. It had a high soil test. And so that all contributed to our phosphorus loads downstream, but it also meant a loss of really good topsoil from those fields in that time. And then when that rain event occurred, that sediment got delivered off the field through those scrape ditches and into the ditch. And so we've lost really good topsoil as a result of that. Just want to mention the difference between soil movement within a field and soil loss off a field. Both are detrimental. The soil movement within a field will affect farm productivity for sure. but it's when that sedimentation leaves the field, that's when we're getting both loss of productivity as well as some off-site environmental impacts. Things like having to clean out the municipal drain or the ditch more often because of the sediment buildup in there. The nutrient levels causing algal growth and sedimentation in some of the rivers and lakes downstream, things like that. So that's when the soil is leaving the field. But when the soil is within the field, yeah, it's still there, but those top hills and that, we just don't have the nutrient levels and the good water holding capacity that we used to have. And so that affects the profitability. This is just an example of a farm that we saw that had a number of years being managed differently. So, and so what were the long-term impacts? Seems subtle at least, but you add 20 years to this and it starts to become significant. On the left side, it was managed more conventionally, and you can see that the rills and that fairly dominant on that slope, whereas this side, not zero by any means, but still there was a little more residue cover, and it helped to hold the soil in place a little better. When we took the yields on that corn in the fall, 65 bushel per acre on this left side and 201 bushels per acre on the right side. And when we looked at the soil health, pretty near half the organic matter on the left side compared to the right side. The upper slopes had much less organic matter in the soils on the left side than on the right side, but the lower area, which is where all the soil ends up, was very identical. So we can say that, yeah, it probably started out pretty much similar, but that's the effect of it through time. And so the only way we could really recover from that would technically be able to take some of that sediment that built up in the bottom slopes and move it back up slope. People are doing that. I mean, if you wanted to see some producers doing that, there's a nice YouTube video here that Farm and Food Care folks put out of one farmer in Ontario doing that. So it can be done, but ideally it'd be nice to just leave that soil where it is and not have to do that through time, but try to keep it where it is. So that's what we want to do when we look at some different best practices from an erosion control standpoint. Just to mention, we often measure soil loss in terms of tons per acre per year. And so we did do an estimate of how many tons per acre per year we figured was happening on this slope, these two slopes, 4.2 on the left side versus 0.5 tons per acre on the right side. So just to give you a perspective of what was happening there in that quantification standpoint. So the best practices then for erosion control, they generally fall into two main categories. There's the agronomic practices and there are the structural practices. The agronomics are the ones that are going to keep that soil right where it is. And really that's your first line of defense, I think. And they're also very effective, not only for water erosion control, but for wind erosion and tillage erosion simultaneously. So that's a good advantage with them. But we do suggest, if there's a systems approach that can utilize both agronomic and structural approaches, then we may have to do that, or that can be ideal in many situations. I'll just go over when we look at soil erosion by water, some of the progression, as I mentioned, the sheet and rill erosion. The agronomic approaches tend to tackle that overland flow, inter-rill, rill erosion type erosion best, whereas the structural approaches tend to then handle those concentrated ephemeral gullies and larger flows that you need to handle. Some of the agronomic practices that I'm talking about, starting sort of simple here, but just moving up would be just crop rotations. Get variety of cropping in there so that the soils can have a bit of resilience in terms of seeing different root masses and different volumes of residue and that type of thing. So that's a key agronomic erosion control practice. Cover cropping, growing in popularity, and so that's great because you're keeping those living roots in there for longer periods of time. You're keeping cover on the soil, protecting it, just like the regular cropping system, but just giving more time of the year when there's a good cover on the soil, and that's important. And then some folks take a look at their tillage direction and their cropping, their strip. They might want to strip crop in fields just to kind of interrupt the flow across the field. Even having a bit smaller fields can do a job in that, and breaking it up a bit so things will just have to slow down when they go across the field. So that's another thing that can be considered on the agronomic side. That agronomic side ties in with some of the tillage choices that you have to do these different things as well. So no-till would be the top end there, and even planting green would be, keeping that living root there as long as possible, and then moving in. That's probably the extreme, but it's not something that nobody's doing. There are people that are trying that and having some success with that. The no-till, where we just work into residue, is probably the more common no-till system. Some don't go quite that far and like to see their fertilizer incorporated and that type of thing. So the strip till option for things like corn and wider planted crops may be the way to go. You can see in this photo here that you still get a nice seed bed, yet you also get some good residue cover between the row to help protect things at that critical planting time. And mulch till as well, where we're keeping a lot of that residue on the soil surface, is advantageous. Combining these agronomic BMPs, both the tillage and the agronomics or the cropping, can have some really dramatic effects right at the point of where the rainfall lands. And so this is just an example from the Tennessee Soil Conservation District, just illustrating that, where the left side, 20 years of no-till only, so no cover crops used much. But you can see there's still some water there lying there in a good storm. And whereas on the right side, that infiltration capacity is improved and we're getting more infiltration and less runoff. And so you can expect to see less rills and less ephemeral gully downstream because of that. So the two work together, and you can really cut down even the need or see some of that rilling and the problems to address downstream because of the combination of things and stacking those best practices. Before we get into the structural measures, there's sort of an interim zone here where I think if you wanted to do something along ditches, things like buffer strips can be valuable just to protect that bank. They do filter some extent as well. Now, by the time you're getting filtering, it's maybe too late, and I still encourage that work right on the field itself. But it does help just stop it at the edge of the field for sure as well. Windbreaks as well are useful, and we think of them for wind erosion control primarily, but they're also useful for water too, because again, you're breaking that slope and you're causing another interruption in the flow path, and all that can help to reduce erosion, and especially that more concentrated flow path type erosion or ephemeral gully stuff. So as I mentioned, the agronomic handles that sheet and interrill and rill type erosion best, whereas the structural erosions tackle that ephemeral gully type problem better. And so we have a number of erosion control structures that you can build on the field and to try to control that erosion in those concentrated flow path areas. Things like grass waterways, rock chutes, and water and sediment control basins. Those three I've sort of highlighted in that orange box there. Just those are probably the three common ones that you can tackle and apply. But there's even simple things like having outlet protection on your tile drains can prevent some of that cutting like you see on the one down below there. It's just, gradually cutting through the ditch bank there. Tile drainage itself, though, can reduce erosion in a sense, because if you can keep good infiltration and you have good agronomy above it to encourage water to infiltrate into the soil. So that can be a help as well. Constructed wetlands, again, you're talking taking the sediment out after it's already left the field, maybe not the most ideal, but at least it hasn't gone totally off site. It's still trapped in that wetland. And the same thing with grass buffers or that at the edge of the fields can trap things a little bit. Again, there's some good topsoil there in that picture that you can see that would be better in the field, but it does slow things down. A couple of things just on those top three, the grass waterways, some things to consider. Mainly, they handle the higher flows and larger watersheds. And when you build one, this was an example, one that was built in 1984, and in 2010, you could still see it was in pretty good shape because a lot of the agronomy on the fields beside it, they were using erosion control practices like tillage, conservation tillage, and that type of thing. And so that waterway was still functioning. But the next year, when transferred to a new landowner and got plowed up, you can see it then lost its function. And now the dead furrows are becoming the waterways. And so we're not getting the benefit from that waterway anymore. So it might as well not even be there. So that maintenance is a factor in these things. And sometimes you periodically have to clean them out. They don't want to have sediment in there, but they will trap it to some extent. So that creates the need for a clean out. The water and sediment control basin, more for smaller watersheds and addressing it out. Some advantages to that over the waterways, you tend not to lose as much land. But they can only handle at the most 30 to 40 acres upstream of watersheds. So you need to size it so that the water volumes that are coming down can be handled and slowly drained out through a surface inlet into a tiled drain underneath, that type of thing. So you're not flooding out your crops above. There's sort of a balance there between how much you can settle out, because the longer you can leave ponds there, the more settling you're going to get. But at the same time, you've got to watch that you don't affect the crops as well. You want to have an overflow spillway because we need the overflow in the event we have bigger storms. And then you still want to have a good erosion control practice on the agronomic side. Otherwise, you're collecting the sediment that would be better up in the field side slopes and that type of thing. You are trapping it, but it would be better back up where it was originally, that's for sure. So, and then just keeping those berms, installing them further up the hill as opposed to down at the lower area where there's the big cutting, will help in reducing that sediment load in that sense. The rock chutes are usually in addition to things like the ends of grass waterways and that, where we can just safely get that water from one level to another, say into a ditch or into some grass waterway or something like that, just to safely get it from one elevation to another, really. And so you want to be able to shape that rock chute so that the water will go over it instead of around it. And then the jaggeder the rock and the rougher the rock, the better. Always put a filter cloth under it. And if you have entrance aprons and exit aprons, that helps to introduce it and get that water into that chute nice and safely. So I just wanted to say that these erosion control solutions that are out there, they're very farm and site specific. And so it's good if, being able to just look at your situation. What do you have to work with to start with? What crop rotations are you using? Can you work in cover crops? Do you see a advantage of putting in buffer strips and windbreaks? Do you like trees or not like trees? Things like that. What's your equipment in terms of your tillage, and when can you maybe switch to a new system through time as other equipment wears out? And direction of tillage, even, which way it erodes more and what the slopes of the fields are and that type of thing. So sometimes even some of these structural measures can be integrated through the drainage acts, and they can be built in that way too. So stacking these BMPs, like this picture in the lower corner, we've got no-till, but at the same time we have a water and sediment control basin through that low draw, are a nice combination that can totally put the package together for a particular farm or field. And just close off just saying that we do have a tool in OMAFRA. You can go to this website down here, and any farm, you can delineate your farm boundary, your field boundary, and then it'll do an analysis of what that risk is on your field for erosion. There's certain areas might be more susceptible to erosion than others. They'll be shown in red or orange. And then from there, you can start to describe, well, what type of tillage practices and cropping practices am I thinking of doing on those fields? For example, in this field, before the landowner bought it, it was a corn, bean, wheat rotation that they fall plowed every year, except they no-tilled the wheat. And you can see that the erosion dropped down, but still some high spots over here that would be, in that 5 to 6 tons per acre per year range. some gully risked areas as well, and these brown areas showing. And so when he took over, he decided to go for strip till ahead of the corn, no-till the beans, and no-till the wheat. And that brought this down even further. So now we're all in the green zone, so the low to very low range in terms of erosion risk. He also installed a couple of water and sediment control basins, 3 exactly, to be exact, through that low cut. And so that sort of slowed the water down through there as well, just to control things at that end too. So there's an example of putting the package together. As I say, a systems approach is key. This is just an example of one that we did, 20 years ago, built this L-shaped berm down here because of the erosion that was happening in this field. But over the 20 years, it kind of filled up, and they said, oh, well, let's put a berm a little higher up here because that will maybe solve the problem. So that's what it looked like once it was built. But even then, the rains and the bare soil conditions, it would reduce the trapping of the water and slow things down a bit, but there was still erosion happening. And so you can see after the rain event on that field, it was still lots of ephemeral gullying happening and poor soil structure and that type of thing. So eventually that led the landowner to say, hey, I got to use some cover crops in here and get some better soil health. And so maybe tackling it in the wrong way, sort of doing the reverse. I'd suggest the agronomy first, then the structures. But at least it shows that, yes, we need the two together to make things go right. So that's all I had to present today. I just want to say thanks for letting me attend to your noon hour series here, and hope you have a good day. We'll talk to you later. Thanks. And if you have any questions, be sure we'll be around for the questions later on.
Excellent presentation, Kevin. Thank you very much. Our fourth and final presenter for today is Valérie Yoder, and she will be presenting on cover crops. Valérie is a graduate of a master's degree in agronomy and has since put her knowledge and skills into research and the organic sector, working for different companies since 2009. Her advice concerning the grain and seed production, fertilization, soil and plant health, and crop management have enabled the development and profitability of many organic farms across the county. Her professionalism has established a real relationship of trust with producers. Eager to advance the industry, Valérie had the opportunity to conduct research on varieties and green manure under organic management. Also keen to pass on her knowledge she has at heart to grow producer skills through conferences and organizations of thematic days.
Income. So any kind of Hello, this is Valérie Yoder, and today I would like to introduce the cover crops and show you how they can have an impact on the soil health and erosion. First, a quick definition. All the green manure cover crops, also called plowed-on crops, are any kind of crop that is turned into the soil and generate no sales income. So any kind of soil that you don't harvest and you turn it to your soil are called green manure. We are using green manure for mostly 3 things: soil improvement, nutrients management, and pest management. Regarding the soil improvement, the biggest one that we are thinking of when we are working with green manure are organic matters. All the grasses and cereals are mostly used for that, such as rye, oats, barley, or ryegrass. They are all high in carbon, and when the carbon breaks down slowly, it increases the organic matter. It will be really important to use all the plant. So let the residue onto your soil and disc it in to have this organic matter improvement. Protecting the soil from erosion. As soon as you have a bare soil, the risk is to have the wind erosion and the water erosion going on. So it's also good to have something covering the ground to protect from erosion. For example, you can use a clover underseeded into a cereal to have those soil covered after harvest. Another one will be to improve the soil structure, which is different than the texture. The structure will be the way the particles of the soil are connecting together. And this is going really with the root system of the green manure. Some green manure are really good to break down the compaction, so to help with the structure of the soil. Having this root system during a long period will also help to stimulate the life into your soil and the biological activity. Another one, why we are using cover crops is the nitrogen. Everybody needs nitrogen into your soil. And for that, we are working with legumes who will fix nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it to the soil through the inoculation. This is a table will show you how much nitrogen is fixed by different legumes. And as you will see, alfalfa, so that's in the best conditions, but will be easy to compare them together. So the best one will be alfalfa and fava bean, but they are followed by sweet clover and all the rest. Another big one, which is not really well known, is how we can increase the phosphorus into your soil. Legumes, and especially the buckwheat, can help for that, right? Oilseed radish as well. They will, through the root system, they will catch the unavailable phosphorus and make it available to the plant. So phosphorus can be caught by buckwheat and radish and be released after for the following crop. Some cover crops, especially on radish, they will catch a lot of nutrients in the soil. So it's always good to have a good green manure after applying manure or other fertilization to be able to catch those nutrients and reduce the leaching problem. Another big group that why we are using green manures are pest management. It's always good to break down the pest cycle. So green manures can help with that. They can break down the cycle of weeds, especially for the annual weeds and the disease. It's really related to the rotation. More plant you have in your rotation, it's always good for reducing the pests. Buckwheat is really perfect to help in your rotation because it's a plant that will do good on heat. So it really go during the summer and help with that. If you would like to break down the life cycle of weeds, the best one will be the plant who has an allelopathic effect. Rye, oat, sunflower, sweet clover are good for that. What's an allelopathic effect? It's a chemical substance released by your roots from the plant, so from the rye, for example, will inhibit the germination of the other plants. Also, when you would like a good weed control, you would like a manure, a green manure that will go fast, so germ fast, cover the ground fast, be thick, and this will help for the weed control. The last one regarding the management of, let's say, the pests, is to attract good bugs. Providing flowers will attract pollination, attract bees, will pollinate your ground, your field. So now I would like to pass through how to choose a green manure. First, for sure, it's the cost. Cost has a really big impact and effect on your decision, but just keep in your mind that you always have to think per acre cost and not per bag cost. For example, a bag of alfalfa, a bag of clover are really expensive, but you have so many seeds in it that the seeding rate are really small per acre. So when you're making the cost per acre, the cost is really reduced. Another one will be the rotation fed. When can you plant your green manure? When can you destroy your green manure? How you can work with that. So it's really a rotation, and this will depend on each farm. Incorporation, can you incorporate by disking, by chemicals, how you can do it? I will put a special point on volunteer into the following crop. And I will give you the example of buckwheat. Buckwheat is a really great crop, easy to grow, really competitive to weeds, provide phosphorus. The problem is if you let it go in seeds, you will have buckwheat for a long time after, and this can become a weed. So you will really have to destroy your green manures at the flowering stage before the seeding to avoid any problem in the following crop. Timing of incorporation. Can you go during the spring, the summer? Would you be able to work your field during the summer or in the fall? It's really related on your field conditions, if you can go early in the field or not. Allelopathic effect, which is a good one on weed control, but the problem is when you have a green manure as rye, for example, and you destroy that just before planting your soybean, it's really recommended to wait 10 days to 2 weeks to reduce this allelopathic effect. Because if you put your soybean straight after destroying your rye, you might see a problem into your germination just due to your allelopathic effect on the rye, from the rye. The rooting system, would you like to work your soil more shallow or more deeper? So do you need more taproot or other kind of roots? This will really depend on your targets. And then the rate of growth. Would you like something to grow fast and quick and dense, or would you prefer something to go slowly because you established that under another crop? Sometimes you don't want to have your green manure going too fast, and the best example for that will be underseeding clover into a cereal. You don't want to have your clover growing higher and bigger and thicker than your cereal, or before that your cereals are ready for harvest. So do you need to take a land off your cash crop production for green manure? The answer is depending on your farm, like most of the answers. Some of my customers are choosing to let the soil with a green manure for at least one year to increase the nitrogen, for example, because be aware that more you let most of the green manures into your soil, better is the effect. If you have a full year of clover, you will see a better impact onto your soil than if you just have it for a few months. But you don't have to. There is some techniques that you can use to have a full crop production for cereal, for example, or corn, like on this picture, and you can underseeding, so underseeding with clover for cereal, or overseeding some green manure into your corn. In this case, you will have your soil covered by something, and you will still be able to get money from your crop, corn or cereal. Also, you can work with rotation. You can implement some green manures right after your crop that you harvested, and this is really related to the timeline and when you can work your soil. I will show you a quick table will help you and give you some big target for each cover crops. So I choose, there is a lot of cover crops actually, but I just picked annual ryegrass compared to rye, radish, mustard, white clover, red clover, vetch, hairy vetch, Australian winter peas, and buckwheat. And these tables will show you why we will use for those green manures. First one, so it's some details regarding if they provide organic matter, pH that you can see that germination, if you can go early in the spring, or if you will have to wait until the soil is warm. For example, hairy vetch and buckwheat needs heat, so you cannot pick those to frost setting, for example. So if your target is a nitrogen, for sure you will work with legumes, will catch nitrogen from the atmosphere to your soil. And so all the clovers, sorry, there is stars missing here in red clover, but red clover is good as well. And also veg, peas, all the legumes. If your target is more a soil conditioner, you will go more with a cereal or a grass. Erosion, you would like something go fast and thick. Rye will be a good one. If you are looking for more weed control, usually we are going with the rye and the buckwheat. That's the most common one if you would like a good weed control. And also after that, if you would like to reduce compaction, if it's a shallow compaction, if it's a deep compaction, radish is recommended because it has a big taproot. Just be careful with the radish. You need a lot of nitrogen to make a big taproot. So it will catch a lot of nitrogen from your field, but the nitrogen will be released after when it will be destroyed. Here is some type of green manures, just a quick picture. It's a 6 weeks green manure. So I put peas. You can see the root system of each one. And so there is some legumes and other green manure. Another one will be destruction. There is a different technique. The most common one will be to use a disc to destroy that. But I will just make a point on the picture on the bottom, which is creeping the rye. There is a technique that you can creep the rye, so roll the rye to make a mulch, and then direct seed the soybean into the rye. When the rye is rolled, the allelopathic effect is reduced just because it's not matched and not chopped. So this is a technique used. The point to know about this technique is the rye has to be at the proper stage to break and not coming back. And to finish my presentation, I will answer the question if we need to go with a straight green manure, straight type of green manure, clover, for example, or if we need to go with a mix. If you have different targets, if you would like nitrogen fixing, but also break down the compaction into your soil, it's always good to go with a mix to have different options and different way to work your soil. This is on the picture, show you an example of a mix of Phacelia, oats, and sunflower. Phacelia and sunflower will catch potassium and phosphorus, but the Phacelia and oats will use the nitrogen from the fall fertilization and catch that. It will also help for the structure of the soil. Another one, the picture on the bottom, which is a buckwheat, but you can also have a buckwheat, mustard, Phacelia, and daikon radish. The daikon radish will help to catch nitrogen, but also break down the compaction, improve your soil. And all the buckwheat, mustard, and Phacelia have a nice flower, will attract the bees. So having those mix can really work to get together and help you. So first things to have to do when you would like to work with green manures is what would you like? What's your target of your green manures? This is the end of my presentation. I will be happy to answer those questions if you have some, and also have a good day.
Thank you very much, Valérie. I noticed that we do have a few questions in the chat, so we have a few minutes remaining. So I will quickly pass the microphone, as it were, over to Vince, who will help to coordinate the question answer before we conclude today's session.
All right, thank you, Brandon. My name is Vince. I'm the Public Information Coordinator at the RRCA. So our first question today, our questions today are from Jackie M. So our first question relates to buffers and setbacks. So in fact, we're having another presentation or another workshop next week on specializing on this very topic. So I would encourage everybody to join that one as well. So I would like to see if perhaps Kevin from OMAFRA would like to answer this one. The question was, when a landowner has cut their property to the waterway and they are to use that property for cash crops, which I assume they will be applying fertilizer to, would it be best practices to leave a healthy buffer zone around the waterway? And if there is any regulations, either municipally or provincially, to regulate not leaving a buffer. So Kevin.
Yeah, thanks. I can take that one. There are that definitely would be a good practice to maintain that buffer. I mean, really the only people that would have a requirement, I guess, would be those that are phased in under the Nutrient Management Act. So that 10 meter and having to do a nutrient management plan. So that would be that 10 foot or 3 meter minimum. So that's really the only one that I'd say is a regulatory requirement. That doesn't suppose, though, I guess, leading into that other question, governmental bodies that have the power to create the policy. I probably pretty well every government level could possibly do it. I think it could begin even with the municipal level. I mean, even when you're doing a municipal drain, right? So even the landowners that are working on a municipal drain could opt to say, we want to keep a buffer on our waterway. I don't know a lot to do that, but I mean, that's not impossible under the Drainage Act if they're so inclined. And then they'd work out the deal and, okay, loss of land, what's the cost benefit and all that kind of thing that you do with any other aspect of municipal drain. So that could be one way of regulating that. And I guess on the provincial side, I mean, there's the province hasn't gone there yet, but I know of states like Minnesota that they've got their buffer rule. And about 5 or 6 years ago, they established that. They said you had to have a 16.5 foot wide buffer on any water course in the state. And so I haven't really looked at what's the effect of that, but that's, so there are examples out there of a province or state doing that. I don't think we've gotten there yet or done that seriously yet. So That's my thoughts on that.
All right, thank you, Kevin. We also had another question on regulation for fertilizer application. So if Hugh, perhaps you would be able to help us out with this one. So the question was, are there any consequences for people that apply fertilizer between December and March? So can you tell us maybe a little bit more about if there's regulations concerning times for fertilizer application?
Well, the restricted period would mostly be that's when you're going to have manure applications, not fertilizer, commercial fertilizer per se. So that's usually in the case where there's not enough manure storage on the farm and it's got to be quickly applied. Basically, you got a pit or something that's filling up and it needs to be spread. There's no actual. It's not illegal to do it. It's restricted, but it's not. There's no punishment, I guess, for doing it. It's when that you get runoff and you get contamination, you get spills essentially into waterways. That's when MOE would come in when there's complaints to do with that. So it's restricted, but it's not illegal. So it's just as a best management practice, it's better to have a nutrient management strategy in place where you're going to have enough storage on the farm in order to get through that restricted period. And if you're not able to spread in the fall, to make sure that you make arrangements to transfer manure off site to another storage somewhere else off site or through a broker where they can arrange to have it stored. Because I've seen some pretty sticky situations where there's been manure applied and it's just run off as soon as we got some snow melt. So.
All right, thank you, Hugh.
Yeah.
I'd also like to mention that if anybody had questions for Sebastian, Sebastian's not able to join us live today, but we have Anne Verhalen from OMAFRA. She's a horticultural crops specialist, and she will be answering any questions for Sebastian today. But we have another fall question. So Ron Brennan is asking, he says, I'm interested in doing fall cover cropping. How would I go about getting started? Who would I speak with? So I'm wondering if Valérie, you wanted to handle this one?
I think the easiest way to get started is to be helped by someone. And there is a lot of agronomists who are working with seeds in the industry. If you contact them, I'm sure they will be pleased to help you to get started with that. But trying to find someone or even a neighbor who has experience with cover crops or someone around I'm pretty sure will be pleased to help.
Oh, and then we have an answer here from Anne. A great place to start when thinking about cover crops, take a look at the Midwestern Cover Crop Council decision tool. Ontario is part of it and has Ontario weather data behind it. And she's also posted a link, so have a look in the chat. And I would say encourage anybody interested in cover crops or other BMPs to consider the advisory service, Agri-Action advisory service, which is going on until accepting applications until August 16th. And you can also find a list of experts in cover crops and other BMPs on our website at rrca.on.ca/BMP. So I believe we're just about, we are 3 minutes over today. So I will pass it back to Brendan. So thank you everyone who helped answer these questions.
Thank you, Vincent. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. I'd like to remind everyone interested in implementing BMPs on their farm that the Agri-Action Advisory Service application deadline has been extended to August 16th, as Vince mentioned. And I encourage everyone to consider taking advantage of this funding opportunity while it is available. Basically, it will cover the costs or some of the costs associated with consultation services with industry experts and BMP experts. So that would be with cover crops, erosion control, soil health, nutrient management planning, any of those aspects, including soil testing or completing a farm health checkup. Vince has also circulated everyone who registered the post-workshop survey, and I would ask that you please fill it out. It will help us greatly fine-tune future workshops and events, as well as give us a idea of how we have performed here today. And lastly, but definitely not least, I'd like to thank Sebastian, Hugh, Kevin, and Valerie for sharing their knowledge with us today. And a special thanks to our funders for this workshop series, which was the Canadian Agricultural Partnership Program, which is a 5-year federal, provincial, territorial initiative, as well as funding through Alice Canada, a community developed, farmer-led and delivered program that works with farmers and producers to enhance ecological services on their farms. Again, thank you for everyone. Thank you to everyone for attending today, and I wish everyone a great rest of the day. And hope to see you at our workshop next week.